Beha'alotcha is tonight's Torah portion. When you step up or when you arise, Beha'alotcha. Numbers chapter 8, 1 to 12, 16 is the Torah portion. I have a Hebrew. We've been doing Hebrew words on Friday night, just looking at a Hebrew word or two, and now we're looking at a Hebrew phrase. And the Hebrew phrase is found in tonight's Torah portion. When we were in Israel, the last time in 2020, when COVID just swept across the land and everything went to just a screeching halt, a young Israeli artist, well, a couple of them, put a song together, and it's from tonight's Torah portion, when Moses cries out to God on behalf of Miriam. And the Hebrew phrase that we're looking at tonight is Elna Ferah Nala. Rifa. Okay. Elna Rifa Nala, which is, "O God, heal her, I pray," referring to Miriam. So Moses cries out to God on behalf of Miriam, and there's a song that's still on the internet, and it's a song that's really about God healing Israel from coronavirus. So tonight's Torah portion is just overloaded with things that we can teach on. It's not like what we've been looking at in the last couple of weeks with the beginning of Numbers, where there are a few things to look at, even though there's always means to find points to teach on. So tonight's Torah portion, though, is brimming with teachable points. And so I have 3 points of interest, and I'm going to have to move along speedily tonight because these 3 points of interest can really bog us down. So the first point of interest is going to be Pesach, celebrated by all, or to be celebrated by all, Pesach. The second point of interest is going to be Israel's faith walk, pillar of fire, pillar of cloud. You know the analogy that was presented in Zemach by Pastor Ken, that the faith walk of Israel is reflected in the pillar of fire by night and pillar of cloud by day. So we'll take a look at that. That's in tonight's Torah portion. And then the third point of interest has to do with the rebellion that ensues following Israel's departure from Mount Sinai. Now at this point, there's been a couple of cases of rebellion expressed through the people of Israel. And that was, of course, at Horeb, when the people cried out for water, and then secondly, when the people worshipped the golden calf. So those are the two principal points, two principal examples of rebellion to this point. What we're going to see in the book of Numbers, though, is that there's going to be case after case after case of rebellion. There were other cases where rebellion, manifests in the people, but we're going to see here in the book of Numbers that it continues throughout Israel's experience all the way up to their entry into the land, which is very unfortunate. Teaching on the book of Numbers, especially this portion of the book of Numbers, is not difficult to do, but very tragic. And I enjoy the fact that there's so much teachable material in this portion of the book of Numbers, but I do not enjoy the actual teaching that involves the rebellion of Israel. It's hideous to look upon. It's tragic to look upon. Right? And so those are the 3 points of interest. Pesach, a celebration for all. Israel's faith reflected in the pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, and rebellion. So let's begin with Pesach. God states very clearly in tonight's Torah portion that the sojourner or the foreigner is to celebrate Pesach, which opens a whole area for us to consider. So in Numbers now, chapter 9, in tonight's Torah portion, we'll see that Pesach is to be celebrated by the non-Israeli who dwells with them. Now, in most cases, the foreigner who lives with the people of Israel, not necessarily in the context of the nation of Israel, because not every foreigner that lives within the confines of Israel is amiable to Israel, right? But the foreigner, the sojourner who journeys with Israel, who is attached to Israel, in other words, is to celebrate Pesach. God does not want people celebrating his festivals against their will. So the sojourner obviously is willfully to celebrate Pesach. So let's read about that. Again in Numbers chapter 9. Now, let's talk about what leads to this. All right, so what leads to this is there were some men in the camp of Israel who didn't want or couldn't celebrate Pesach because they had handled a dead person. They were unclean. And according to Torah, if you're unclean, you cannot approach God, and you cannot approach him, and you have to approach him with the celebration of Pesach. So they came to Moses and they asked Moses what to do. What should we do? And Moses went before God, and God said, the following month, on the 14th of the second month, they are to celebrate Pesach. So if someone is unclean or is on a journey, it says it there in chapter 9, in verse 7, I think it is. If someone is unclean for whatever reason, or someone's on a journey, they cannot celebrate Pesach on the 14th of the first month. They can celebrate it on the 14th of the second month, right? But then it goes on to talk about in chapter 9, verse 14, about the sojourner or the alien who sojourns among the foreigner, who sojourns among the people of Israel. So let's read it. If an alien sojourns among you and observes the Passover to the Lord according to the statutes of the Passover and according to the ordinances, so he shall do it. You shall have one statute both for the alien and for the native in the land. So I'm glad that it makes that statement at the end of the verse, because the same statement is made in Leviticus chapter 24 as well, verse 22, that there is one statute for the man of Israel, and it is the same for the sojourner, the foreigner, who joins themselves to the people of Israel. So we can take away from that all of the festivals are for us to also celebrate, not just Pesach. Pesach was the point of interest here. Pesach was the emphasis here, and so God sort of took the opportunity to say also the sojourner, the alien who celebrates Pesach, is to do it in the same way as the native born of Israel. So now let's talk about that for a moment. That brings to light some good possibilities. How about Shabbat? And how about the rest of the celebrations, the festivals? If we're to celebrate Pesach, then we're to celebrate the other ones as well. There is a bit of a, not only in the Christian church, but there's a bit of a sentiment in Israel today that Gentiles are not to celebrate their festivals, Shabbat and Pesach and the others, for a number of reasons. All right, one has to do with circumcision. We're not circumcised. The uncircumcised is not to celebrate the festivals. It's in tonight's Torah portion as well. So how do we feel about that? Being uncircumcised, being unable, being uncircumcised to celebrate Pesach or the other festivals. Even they would say to celebrate Shabbat, you have to be circumcised and within the house of Israel. How do we feel about that? Well, we can say, well, you know, we're circumcised on our hearts. In our hearts we're circumcised, so therefore we feel like because we're inwardly circumcised that we can celebrate the festivals. And that's a good conclusion, I think. But the festivals, for us, we would maintain. Shabbat, Pesach, and all the others, we are like sojourners, therefore. We are like the aliens who have joined ourselves to Israel, aren't we? If we see ourselves that way, then that's who we are. On Sunday, I'm going to talk about, I had planned to talk about this tonight and go read it tonight, but it's just too much to deal with. And I thought that I would teach on this on Sunday. On Sunday, we're going to see in Isaiah chapter 56 very clearly that God is prepared or is preparing people from among the nations who will observe his Shabbats and do it to the extent that they would acquire names that are better than sons and daughters. And when he refers to names that are better than sons and daughters, he's referring to Israel, natural Israel. Because these are foreigners who will join themselves to Israel and observe his Shabbats. We'll see that on Sunday when we look at Isaiah chapter 56. But yes, we are to celebrate his festivals. We are sojourners. Now, of course, not all of Christianity will see themselves as sojourners. Generally speaking, why would a Christian want to consider themselves a sojourner in the midst of Israel? Why? They have no reason to do this. And why is that? Because they've been misled. Their Christianity is flawed, is why they would see themselves as not being sojourners. Clearly, Paul said that we're grafted into Israel. And if we're grafted into Israel, then yes, we're sojourners with Israel. We're foreigners, aliens who have been accepted in the camp of Israel. We are. And there's so much more I can say to compound this. Isaiah said it, God's going to choose from among the nations a priesthood that will serve him in the end of creation, in the millennial kingdom, and then beyond. So yes, we are that people, a people who God will create in the earth, chosen from every kindred, tongue, and nation. Revelation chapter 5, of course. So it is for us to celebrate God's festivals. Regardless of what Christianity says, we are sojourners in the midst of Israel. And if we consider ourselves to be sojourners in the midst of Israel, we have to therefore take on a very humble position towards Israel. Do you follow me? We should not and cannot take a position where we're above Israel or we're beyond Israel. If we're sojourners grafted into Israel, then we are what? Servants to Israel. Right? A grafted branch serves the tree it's grafted to in order to produce a required fruit. I've said that before, and that's exactly who we are. Paul did not make a mistake when he said that we're grafted into Israel. And he was referring to the rich olive tree. He made no mistake with that statement. That's something that he deliberately and with punctuation wanted to state. We, the church, we are. And so we're sojourners, and we should never lose touch of that reality. Sunday, I'll expand on this a lot more as it relates to Isaiah 56. Now, so let's talk about Israel's faith walk, their walk of faith, as it relates today, following after the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day. So in Numbers chapter 9 now, verse 23. Numbers chapter 9, verse 23. So what leads to this particular verse? Moses is relating on behalf of God to the people of Israel that they ought to follow God carefully in the wilderness and only take up camp when God signifies, when the glory of God, the Shekinah glory of God would lift from beyond the tent of meeting and ascend. It was an indicator that they had to move. And so only then would they be allowed to move forward. So they had to follow that cloud and that fire by night very carefully, very rigidly. Now, the fact that they had to follow the fire by night says what? That even at night, God will indicate that it's time to move on. You follow me? Because whatever was in the cloud shone brightly at night, like a fire. So the glory of God, the kavod Yehovah, that the cloud represented and the fire represented, was one thing. It wasn't two things, fire and cloud. It was one object. I shudder to call it an object because it's God's glory. So the glory over the tabernacle was one glory. Shone brightly at night, was a pillar of cloud by day. And even at night, God will indicate, and that's why he indicated through that light that Israel had to move. So what does that speak to? It speaks to the fact that we should be ever ready, even when we're at rest, to hear from God and obey. And that's the reality of the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. So it brings us to verse 23, chapter 9. And at the command of the Lord, they camped. And at the command of the Lord, they set out. They kept the Lord's charge according to the command of the Lord through Moses. And so here is the way by which Israel is to venture out into the wilderness, following God's every indicator that he's moving forward. So he's literally the guiding entity in the midst of Israel. He is guiding Israel. Israel is to follow him. So that's a picture of Israel's faith walk. You don't know exactly where he's leading you. You don't know why he's pulling you up at midnight on a Tuesday night, but he is. And you're to follow him. He doesn't explain where he's going or why he's going in that place or why he's chosen that time. You're simply to surrender to his direction. And that was Israel's experience. And this is for us also, right? This is allegorical for us as it relates to our faith walk. We have to simply follow after God and make no moves apart from his movement. Apart from his direction, we do not go forward. We only move based on his movement. And that's really the crust, the essence of faith. So we learned this in Zamach. Pastor Ken has taught this for many years, that we walk by faith. Pastor Ken used to teach this quite regularly. You do nothing apart from faith. He would say that, he used to say that every aspect of your life is to be mapped out by faith. And this is absolutely the case. Israel in the wilderness is a wonderful picture of that, isn't it? Make no moves apart from him. And so that's what we see there. Now let's move on into chapter 10 now. Now what do we see here? God has prepared Israel to go out. He's instructed them exactly how and what array they're to march out. The tribes, the 12 tribes, and the formation of the tabernacle and everything. And they're set to go. So at this moment, in Numbers chapter 10, Israel is on the verge of setting out, marching out as an army. And this is what Israel is. Israel is an army marshaled according to God's direction, and they're going out. What is their purpose? To enter into the land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they were an army. The objective of the army, based on God's will, was to push out the Canaanites. That sounds awfully military, but that's exactly what God had in mind for Israel. Should Israel had believed him and obeyed him, he would have pushed the Canaanites out. Now you might say, hey, that sounds a bit harsh. That's almost like genocide. Well, who am I to argue with God or to question him? This is what God had in mind. You see, because we don't know the full extent of the iniquity of the Canaanites. We don't understand how profoundly pollutant they were to the land of Israel. Not pollutant in a natural sense, but spiritually. The Canaanites worshiped the worst, they practiced the worst form of paganism. The absolute worst form of paganism. And they were plugs of the devil. They were plants of the devil. The devil knew that that land would be sanctified by God, by faith, through his servant Abraham. The devil knew this. And so what did the devil do? He planted his plugs. He planted his plants in the land that will corrupt the land and hopefully prevent the ultimate sanctification of the land. That's what the devil wanted to do. And that's why in Genesis chapter 15, God speaking to Abraham said that when your descendants come out from 400 years of slavery, that's when the sin of the Amorite will be complete. Now, he didn't say it that way. I back engineered it. But that's exactly what God said to Abraham on the very night that the covenant was cut. Your descendants will go into a land and will be kept in slavery for 4 generations, for 400 years, and in the 4th generation they will come out, for the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. That infers, in fact, it strongly states that God is preparing the people of Israel to bring judgment upon the Amorites and the Perizzites the Canaanites. And that was the purpose. So here we see in chapter 10 now, the people of Israel are arrayed as an army. And God's objective is to bring them from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, and from Kadesh Barnea they would enter into the land and systematically, step by step, take the land. This is God's intent. Sanctify the land. So let's read this in chapter 10, verse 33 to 36. It's hard for me to conceive that just in the last couple of weeks my eyes have gotten worse. And tonight in worship, I conceded that I have to go get real glasses and not these Walmart deals here. You know, 3 for $7 or something. So yeah, I have to deal with the fact that I need glasses. I got to go get glasses. I've been fighting it for a long time, but I have to give in. So Numbers chapter 10, we're going to read 33 to 36. Thus set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days. Journey with the ark of the covenant the ark of the covenant of the Lord, journeying in front of them for the 3 days to seek out a resting place for them. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day, and they set out from the camp. Then it came about when the ark set out that Moses said, rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. When it came to rest, he said, return, O Lord, to myriad thousands of Israel. So this is it. Israel now is singing the final tune before they go out. Arise, Lord, let your enemies be scattered. Yakum Adonai. I say a final tune, but he made the statement. Yakum Adonai, and he, arise, O Lord. And so now Israel is about to set forth on this journey. What happens? Immediately, almost immediately, rebellion ensues. The devil wasted no time. Rebellion ensues. God will act promptly to deal with the rebellion. Later on in the book of Numbers, we'll see where God says, 10 times you have rebelled against me. Now, the rebellion is targeted against Moses, right? In most cases, it's against Moses. And why is that? Because Moses is appointed by God to lead the people. And so that there's an ongoing pattern of a propensity to rise up and challenge Moses and Aaron. But it's rebellion against God. When God's servants are rebelled against, when there's an uprising, I should say, against God's servants, it's really against God. The responsibility of God's servant is to recognize it and not take it personally, but to recognize that this is not against me, this is against God. Moses does very well in that regard, except one time. We'll see that in the book of Numbers. In one case, Moses did not appropriate the rebellion that was targeted against him to God, and he took it personally. And this was a very tragic event in the life of Moses. Moses will go on to regret what happened. He acted out in his flesh. He began to personalize the rebellion. It's never for us to personalize rebellion when people are actually rebelling against God, even though they're in your face doing it. God will take care of rebellion if we can just surrender it, those in leadership. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, right? We understand that. Who said that? Well, Samuel said that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. What does he mean? It's as the sin of witchcraft. I think there are many facets to that question that needs to be answered. And I'm not equipped or ready to deal with that question in its fullness at this point. But I can tell you that witchcraft is a booger. It is a tough spirit to extract. It is. And the longer you leave it intact or entrenched, the more difficult it gets. Rebellion is like that. And that's one aspect of rebellion being as a sin of witchcraft. Now, so I'll tell you a little story. So yesterday I was doing some work for someone in the congregation, And I got a splinter, a nice one. I know about splinters. I've got many of them. And I got a nice splinter right in the palm of my left hand. And I looked down there and it was buried. And what did I do? I took out my knife, my dull knife, and I started doing surgery. And I dug, I cut, I dug. I have a little cut right there, so I got the splinter out. Why did I do this ridiculous, hideous thing? Because I know enough about splinters to say if I had left it even for half an hour, it would have become incredibly more difficult to come out. So in this case, and become infected in very, very short space of time, because the piece of wood, the door I was working on, was 40 years old. And even from the short time that the splinter was in my hand, only about 5 minutes, it's already infected, but the splinter is out. So I took my dull knife, and I started regretting that I didn't sharpen it right away. So I'm doing surgery with a dull knife, and finally I cut, I poke, I scratch, I pull, and the splinter came out. I knew that it had to come out pronto. The spirit of rebellion is like that. You cannot allow it to fester, not even for any period of time. You have to move to get it out, because the end effect of leaving rebellion in place is highly, highly infective, and it spreads. And that's the point to saying that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. It will spread. I've seen it not just once, I've seen it over and over and over. When someone is in rebellion, the rebellion in most cases will ultimately be targeted towards leadership. And when it does, it begins to permeate and spread. It always does. You know, the point of rebellion would be something that's not really directly towards, you know, Larry, Willie, or myself, or someone else, but it will become leadership. And then all of a sudden, that person that's in that place of rebellion is talking to this one, or talking to that one, permeating and spreading the rebellion. At that point, the splinter is beginning to be infested. It's got to be pulled out. It's got to be pulled out. So when I got that splinter yesterday with my knife, and I knew it was going to hurt to perform surgery with a dull knife, I knew it was going to hurt, and it did, but I knew I had to get it out. And this is where Israel is. The splinter of rebellion is embedded within Israel. It happens over and over and over. And God moves quickly, but that splinter of rebellion is deep in Israel. And it will require ultimately a dispersion, 3 of them, to get that splinter out. And that splinter did come out. Israel is free of the splinter, but like me, I'm feeling the effects of it. All right, so we can go, I won't go on any further about that. So let's read about this rebellion. Again, it's going to repeat itself over and over. In tonight's Torah portion, only in tonight's Torah portion, there are 2 cases of rebellion. 2. In tonight's Torah portion. They just left Mount Sinai. They just began their journey to God's land to carry out God's purpose. And within days, it seems, there are 2 cases of rebellion. That's why I say that this portion of the book of Numbers is tragic. It's tragic. I enjoy teaching it because it's fruitful. You can address very important things and aspects and concepts with this, but it's a tragic portion. So now in Numbers chapter 11, there's a complaint. The people are complaining to Moses, complaining to God. They're complaining to Moses about God, but they're making it all about Moses. Again, Moses' attitude here is exactly where it should be. He does not take it personally. He goes to God. God reacts. Let's read about it. Numbers chapter 11, I'm going to read 1 to 6. I want to try to. I can't believe my eyes are actually degenerating. That's a tough thing to deal with. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. He recognized that splinter right away. And the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. So consider that. The people are arrayed like an army, surrounding the camp where God is camped. And the rebellion begins, and God immediately begins to work to extract the splinter. And the people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of the place was called Tebarah. Tebarah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. You got to visualize what that was like. Tebarah. Named Tebarah because God's fire consumed on the outskirts because of the rebellion. So God does not accept rebellion easily. He deals with rebellion in a very harsh way. Now we might say, hey, that's the Old Testament God for sure. That's the Old Testament God that preacher talked about. Yes, it is. It's also the New Testament God as well. So God's anger burnt against the people of Israel. He began to consume them. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remembered the fish which we used to eat eat free in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna." So they're complaining about the food, the manna. This supernatural diet that God is providing for them that will sustain them throughout their time in the wilderness. They need not take stocks of food. They need not worry about having enough carbohydrates, enough vegetables, enough protein. This food will sustain them. And they knew that the food was enough to sustain them, but they didn't just want that. They wanted the leeks, the melons, the fish, a good fish broth, some fried fish. They wanted food that they were accustomed to. They were grumbling about their predicament, and they saw God's provision as a predicament. Now let's read about the manna. It says in verse 7 to 9 concerning the manna. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like the appearance of brillium. What's brillium? It's like a sap. I think it's a stone, right? Brillium is a stone, and it's made from the sap of trees. So it's like topaz, a topaz-looking type stone. So this coriander seed is yellowish, goldish in color. The people will go about and gather it and grind it between two millstones, or beat it in the mortar, and boil it in the pot and make cakes with it. And its taste was as the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall with it. So how did they receive the manna? Like dew. Came down from heaven. But it was a seed. It was seeds, actually. It wasn't something that came ready-made. They had to gather it up in the morning and beat it into a paste and bake it. So it wasn't just like, in the Ten Commandments, right? You've seen the Ten Commandments. What do we see in the Ten Commandments? You have these fluffy little things, poofy things that comes down from the sky. And the ladies that are collecting it with their baskets, it's as if they're dancing and manna. So made it look very easy, made it look very provisionary, right? God was providing this wonderful food from heaven. But that's not the reality of the story. The real story is they had to pick this thing up every morning, pronto, and grind it into a paste and bake it, day in, day out. God's food, God's sustenance is more than enough, but it's not something that you just freely take. So this interferes with some of our teachings concerning grace, right? What does the manna represent? God's provision? The manna is much more than God's provision, isn't it? What does the manna represent? Jesus said, "I am that manna that came down from heaven." So Jesus is the manna. The manna in the wilderness is symbolic of Jesus, God's provision. It's symbolic of us refusing the things of Egypt, the fish, the melons, the leeks, all of the good things. We refuse it and we embrace what God has provided, manna. It's not something we desire necessarily. It's just, it tastes like cake, but it's day in, day out. It's the same thing, but it's to sustain us. But we would choose the things of this world, right? That's the nature of our condition. Even we as believers, sometimes we can get to the place where we long for the things of this world. And are there wonderful, delightful, delectable temptations in this world for us? Absolutely, there are. And we have to overcome it and settle for the manna that God has provided, the simple but profoundly nutritious food that He has provided, what we need to be sustained in this wilderness of our life. The devil is increasing the menu, folks. He's increasing the menu. It's not just melons and leeks and fish any longer. It's much, much more. The menu has grown, folks. And beware of technology. I want to warn you about this again. Beware of technology. Technology makes your sin much more prolific, or makes the capacity to sin much more prolific. There's this thing that the Chinese has introduced on social media called TikTok. Beware of this Chinese introduction. It is designed to eat away at your brain cells. I know it is. I looked at it a few times and I know what it does. It appeals to the most carnal, basic nature of the fallen man. And if you attach yourself to it, it's going to feed away at your brain cells. I know it is. It's going to lead you into all sorts of delectables. But most importantly, it, like many other delights of this world, will lead you away from the manna that God has provided. What God has provided may not be particularly attractive, tasty, filled with variety, but it's what we need to be sustained with. It's what will nourish us, spiritually speaking. We need that manna. Jesus is that manna that came down from heaven. And our tendency is, much like Israel, to grumble about what we're not getting. And that's when we end up in trouble. Israel is in horrible, horrible sin. And what happens? How does God respond? Moses intercedes. He didn't take it personally. Moses intercedes. What did God do? He gave them what they wanted, quail. God will do this. He gave them more than they expected, quail, as much as they can possibly want. I call it the plague of quail, because the quails, they ended up being a plague. Sometimes if we insist upon it, God will give us what we want, what we clamor for. Do you want TikTok? Have as much as you want. Do you want pornography? Take your fill. Do you want the things of this world? Okay. Have your fill. But there's something coming. That's what Israel experienced. Every bit of what they wanted, quail, none, endless quail. Let's read it. Numbers chapter 11 now. Is that what I want to read? No, let's read 11:31 to 35. Now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side, and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. That's a lot of quail. The people spent all day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers. A homer is a measuring device. It's a lot. And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. While the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. Doesn't tell us exactly what that plague was, but a very severe plague. So the name of the place was called Kiryat Hatava, because there they buried the people who had been greedy. From Kiryat Hatava, the people set out for Hazeroth, and they remained at Hazeroth. So God reacted to the rebellion of Israel in a very harsh, very concise, a very determined way. And why was he doing this? Because to whom much is given, much is required. The people of Israel had been redeemed from slavery. Plagues he brought upon Egypt, brought them into the wilderness, and they are showing a propensity towards rebellion. God had to move to stop it. Did he stop it in this case? No. They continued to rebel against him. So the story with the plague, the story with the quails is an unfortunate story. Israel was not satisfied with what God provided. And that's something, again, that we have to see in ourselves. Are we satisfied with what he has provided? Do we feel like he could have done better? Do we feel like he has held back on us? Maybe we need to consider that what he has provided is more than enough. And we should not rebel against him by expressing dissatisfaction, because it's rebellion. Also, I said there are two examples of rebellion in tonight's Torah portion. So shortly after they settled at Hazeroth, something happened, another case of rebellion. And this rebellion was against Moses, but it was actually against God. You see, this particular rebellion denotes the simple fact that if you rebel against God's servant, you rebel against God himself. Now, I suppose there might be people who would take that from a self-serving perspective, but Moses humbled himself and did so very well, and became the vessel of intercession that will intercede on behalf of the very people that rebelled against him, rebelled against God. In this case, the rebellion came from Miriam, his own sister. And his own brother Aaron seemed to be involved in it. So Aaron has a tendency to find himself wrapped up in some unfortunate instances, right? He has a way of getting involved in things that he should not get involved with. It happened at Mount Sinai when they, what did he say? He threw the gold into the fire and out came a golden calf, right? Aaron had a propensity to get himself involved in things that he shouldn't. It happens here again with Miriam's rebellion. Now this rebellion is unfortunate, but it shows the messiahship of Moses. It shows the humility, and it shows the attribute of Messiah, like I said, in Moses. Let's read about it. Numbers chapter 12, yes, 1 to 4. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. So this is Miriam and Aaron. It's a fascinating fact that God did not strike Aaron. God ultimately would bring judgment upon Aaron, but because of the fact that he and Moses stood up against him by lashing out at the people, they rebelled against him. Moses and Aaron rebelled against him. I want to say this, and this is something we'll see as we study. God sees Aaron in the same light that he sees Moses. They are both one. That's from God's perspective. And he will not judge Aaron without judging Moses. And he will not judge Moses without judging Aaron. He negated the judgment that Aaron was worthy of, right? Because both Aaron and Miriam rebelled against God when they spoke against Moses. God did not judge Aaron. And again, the reality of that has to do with the fact that Aaron was the other half of Moses. The office of Messiah was meant to be Moses only. And because of Moses' lack of faith, it became Moses and Aaron. So God withheld that judgment from Aaron. But his sister Miriam, her treatment from God is very harsh. We're going to see here that God took offense to this particular rebellion. What did they do? They spoke out against Moses because he had married an African woman, a Cushite woman. This is not his wife from Saudi Arabia, the Midianite. This is not the Midianite, Zephorah. This is a different woman. So Moses took a second wife. That's clear because there's a huge difference between a Midianite, who Zephorah was, and a Cushite. If you have any background in the knowledge of the Bible and history as it relates to the different tribes and so on, you know that the Cushites were Hamitic, and all of Africa, effectively all of Africa, descended from the Cushites. So his wife was an African woman. His former wife, or still his wife, Zephratah, was a Midianite who was Semitic, right? A descendant of Ishmael. So there's racism here. Blatant racism, right? They're speaking out against Moses because he married a Cushite woman. God did not take lightly this situation. He responds very heavy-handedly. Let's read. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? The Lord heard it. You see, God didn't wait for Moses to bring a report to him. God responded quickly. He heard it, the rebellion against Moses because he had married an African woman. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. I believe it. Moses didn't write this. Let's be real. This is not the penship of Moses. This is someone writing concerning Moses. And the writer here makes a very important statement. And why is this statement made at this time? Because Moses had every right to be upset. He had every right to just be irate. But instead, he humbles himself. You see that? Sometimes we think that Moses actually wrote the first 5 books, the Torah, but he didn't. It's written by someone else. But it's about the life of Moses. So, Moses was humble, and his response here is what denoted that he was humble, more humble than anyone else. Now listen to this. Suddenly, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam, you 3 come out to the tent of meeting. So the 3 of them came out. Let's read verse 5. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent. And he called to Aaron and Miriam. When they had both come out, he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all his household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? God is taking this very personally. This is rebellion against him in speaking out against Moses. Even though Moses amply showed himself to be humble, to be a servant, God took issue with Aaron and Miriam. It's fascinating again that he didn't judge Aaron at this time. But how did he judge Miriam? She became leprous. No doubt she was going to die. Let's read verse 9, 10. Let's read on in the same chapter. So the anger of the Lord burnt against them, and he departed. Then when the cloud had withdrawn from over the tent, Behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow. As Aaron turned toward Miriam, behold, she was leprous. So a couple of things can be considered here, possibilities. One, this was Miriam's initiative, and I believe it was. Aaron, again, had a propensity to get himself involved in things that he shouldn't. But God didn't judge him. He was certainly guilty because he was a part of the rebellion. God didn't judge him because of that position in Messiah. Aaron was the second half of Moses in the office of Messiah. So God did not judge him. But he certainly judged Miriam. Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, I beg you, do not, on account of this sin to us, I beg you, do not account this sin to us, in which we have acted foolishly and in which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes from his mother's womb." So Aaron is pleading on behalf of Miriam. Do something, Moses. Intervene. And Moses does. All right? And we see it here in verse 13 and 14. Let's read it. Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "O God, heal her, I pray, Lefana. Heal her, I pray." But the Lord said to Moses, "If her father had put spit in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut up for 7 days outside the camp, and afterwards she may be received again." So Miriam was shut up outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move until Miriam was received again. What a tragic story, right? And such a horrific picture of what rebellion does. What rebellion does. Now, again, what was the root of this, the offense? Working in Miriam and then also Aaron. They saw Moses as less than anointed because he had an African wife. If that's not true, it would not have, what we see in verse 1, chapter 12, would not exist, would not be written. Verse 1, chapter 12 again. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the African wife that he had taken. So you see, from Miriam's point of view, suddenly Moses cannot be that anointed. Why would he marry an African wife if he's that anointed? And they begin to speak against him. And what was their position? We're anointed as he is. We're all anointed, folks. God took issue with this himself. He didn't wait around for something to brew on this. He just intervened immediately, like the splinter. He whipped out his dull knife and said, "I'm going to get this out of here." Got it out. He was harsh, leprous. Who knows if Moses did not intercede on behalf of Miriam, if she would have simply died in the wilderness, perhaps. We don't know. God made a determination. And even in that determination of showing his grace, he made such a powerful statement. If her father had spit in her face, would she not be cursed? Right. Put her out for 7 days. God showed mercy. Did she deserve mercy? No. Rebellion does not deserve God's mercy. It is as the sin of witchcraft. I've seen this over and over and over. There is no grace for the sin of rebellion, only deliverance. Only deliverance. If there's a spirit of rebellion, God's grace is nullified in that person who embraces the sin. Rebellion is like that. It is something that you embrace. It's something that you internalize. And once you internalize it, it attaches itself to your soul. Becomes very difficult to deal with, like that splinter. And what becomes necessary is deliverance. Do you think Miriam was delivered from this experience? What do you think? Do you suppose that her experience was enough to bring her away from that place of rebellion? We don't see any more rebellion in the life of Miriam following this case. We don't see it. It doesn't exist. We see a little bit in Aaron, but not in Miriam. God delivered her. The story there is simple. In your rebellion, you will not have God's mercy. It is as witchcraft. What did God say about witchcraft in the land of Israel? Stone them, get them out. Show them no mercy. Only deliverance can come for witchcraft. In the case with the land of Israel, the witches had to be driven out. The ones practicing the occult, worshiping the Baal, the Ashtoreth, and the Molech had to be driven out. That's strong stuff. Now, could there have been repentance? Of course. Miriam, before she opened her mouth against Moses to speak rebellion, she could have been convicted in her heart, which I think she must have been, but her heart was given over to rebellion, but so she could have repented. But once she carried out the act, there was no hope. No grace for that particular sin except deliverance. And in the deliverance comes the picture of God's grace. God is merciful to correct you. God is gracious to correct you. We know that we are maturing as believers when we see God's intervention in light of correction as deliverance and His grace. We know that we're growing strong as believers when we see His correction as grace. Because we all fall short, don't we? We all fall short. We all get to that place where we need God's correction from time to time. I got there. Yeah, I got there, and it's painful when it happens. No one enjoys a good spanking. But there are deliverances in spankings. I grew up in a colonial island when I grew up. But the system of school in Trinidad at that time was Cambridge, from London. And in the Cambridge system in the colonies or former colonies, you got caned. You got caned, folks. I'm not kidding you. I was caned many times. Many times. Oh, my standard 4 teacher. Standard 4 equates to about 10 years old. What grade are you in at 10 years old? Fourth grade, 5th grade, right? 5th grade. So 5th grade. So I was in standard 4. And I was in the top class in the school in standard 4. And it's very much to whom much is given, much is respect, much is expected. You had to perform in Clarky Boy's class. We didn't call him Clarky Boy to his face, but he was Mr. Clark. You had to perform in Clarky Boy's class. Every Monday morning, a pop quiz. What's the pop quiz about? No one knows except him. But come Friday evening, he was brutal. Come Friday afternoon, he will come into class after his lunch break with feather dusters. A pack of them. 6 of them in a pack. Where did he get the feather dusters? From the Chinese supply store down the road. These are canes with feathers on them that comes from the Orient. You can bend that cane around like this. And on many, many Friday evenings, he would have the clowns of the class sit up there and pluck the feather dusters. They sit there and pluck it, and then there was a skin attached to the cane. They pull the skin off, and he'll have 2 or 3 nice canes waiting for Monday morning. That's the school that I came from. I've been caned many times. I know what discipline does. I know how it can affect you, but I know that it can bring deliverance. It can make things in you go check. Many times I've experienced it. I want to tell you this. This country is in the trouble that it's in because our children and our youth, they don't understand what discipline is. I'm just being honest with you. Our children are not disciplined. I'm not saying that we should be brutalized like Mr. Clark did with us, but there should be something that brings fear into their lives. We used to go, let me tell you something, I'll tell you right now. We used to wear little khaki shorts for school, at that stage. Little khaki shorts and little button-up shirts. And many a Monday mornings, I will go there with three pants on. You think it helped? It didn't help. Guys would be oiling themselves down with Vaseline and other things, hoping that the blows wouldn't stick. Let me say something about this, and I'll end the story about the discipline I received as a kid. I was bled 3 or 4 times, being caned. Now, when you're bled, being disciplined, something happens on the inside of you. Now, you can say that's why he's so messed up, and perhaps that's true. But I have a healthy regard and respect for authority. I will not rebel against authority. And that's because of my experience growing up as a kid. Being disciplined when I was wrong. You don't dance on a piano at the age of 11, get caught, and not be spanked. And that was me. I was dancing on the piano, got caught, and got thoroughly spanked, bled. Teaches you something. So this is the story here of rebellion. It's not a pretty story. It's not something we like to hear about. And we're going to see many more cases like this as Israel gets ready to enter into the land of Israel. Tragic cases, but it allows me to put the emphasis on how much God loves an obedient heart, how much he loves a humble heart, how much he loves the heart of the person who will surrender to his authority. It will also give me the opportunity to reflect to you how much he despises rebellion. This is important for us to know. Because in a society where our children are not being corrected, rebellion comes naturally. Is that true? Can we see it? Yes. Can we not see this in our children, in our youth? Tragic, folks. There is a rash of fistfights flooding this country. Folks are just duking it out for all sorts of no reasons at all, just duking it out at Burger King, at 7-Eleven, at churches. It's a bizarre phenomenon. It's part of the degeneration of this country, folks. It's part of the degeneration. And it's happening because we don't even have a clue concerning what it is to surrender to God's authority. We have no fear for authority, so we can live chaotically, we can live haphazardly, we can live anywhere we want because there's no line of authority, and we need not fear authority. Which is exactly what's happening, right? Not with us. Not with God's people. God's people ought to fear God and reverence his authority. And consider Moses, how he was the humblest person known at that time. Whoever wrote this book, Numbers, maybe he wrote all the books, or she wrote all the books, I don't know. Maybe it was a collective effort, I don't know. But they saw Moses in the most pure, humble light. He existed in that light because he humbled himself even when they were coming against the most precious thing to him, his wife, and his anointing, his office. He humbled himself and he interceded on their behalf. That's the servant of God. And as we say many times, the servant of God is the one who bears the rod. If you're a servant of God, if you're serving him in the way that you ought to, then you have the authority. If you're not serving him, you have no authority. If you're not a servant, you cannot lead. This is a point that we come to over and over and over. The leading servant, the servant who leads. This is Moses. I said to you a few weeks ago that we are a congregation of leaders. And that's my expectation. That's the expectation of the elders concerning you, that each of you will adapt and transform your way of life and become leaders, become servants, serve each other, surrender to each other, love each other, overcome the natural. When you come up against a situation with a brother or sister, you reverence the anointing that's on that person. One of the things we do, or we attempt to do, is if we enter into a conflict with a brother or sister, and I've seen this about 1,000,000 times, if we enter into a conflict with a brother or sister, and the conflict is deep enough, we immediately villainize that person. Why? Because I'm not rebelling against God. That person is the person I'm coming against. That person is not of God. So that's why I'm justified in doing what I'm doing. I've seen that many times. And it's just a way of justifying your rebellion. No. Paul admonishes us in Romans chapter 11 to treat each other better than ourselves. That goes to the royal law that James talked about when James said, treat each other the way you want to be treated. I would go further. Treat each other better than you want to be treated. That's the royal law. And we'll be servants. Each of us will be leaders. We are, like I said before, we are a congregation of leaders. And you don't want to mess with someone that looks like this, do you? My demeanor and my voice and my whatever gives the impression sometimes that I'm heavy, I'm whatever, I'm hard, and this attracts rebellion. It attracts the sentiment that, I don't have to listen to him. I understand that. I'm not the most humble man in the world. I'm not Moses. But my goal is to lead you to become servants, to lead you to become the least, each of us the least. The least shall be the greatest, folks. And that's referring to God's kingdom. So Shabbat Shalom.